Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party candidate for governor. I'm, I am the Green Party candidate for governor. I keep saying that. I was the Green Party candidate for president, as well as the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and organize around the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker and I ran on. So today, I just want to say a few words about what's going on with ballot access and voter intimidation, and a little bit about COVID, and then get to your questions and comments. I mean, first thing I'd like to report is good news for a change. The Green Party in New Mexico successfully turned in a petition. It was certified by their Secretary of State on Thursday that they're back on the ballot. And we've heard of no challenges, no lawsuits coming from the Democrats. New Mexico's got a pretty easy petition compared to a lot of states, but that's good news. And it's just encouraging that, Greens are still out there, fighting for ballot access. We only needed 0.5%, I think, in New Mexico in the presidential race to keep the ballot line. And we ended up, really close, but just short. And, 2020 was a tough year. Anybody but Trump, most progressive-minded people felt they had to vote for Biden and really didn't factor in whether the state was close or not. But in any case, New Mexico's back on the ballot. Congratulations to them. Back here in New York, I've talked here before about how they changed the laws, tripled the votes you need to get on the ballot or keep your ballot line, tripled the signatures you need, doubled the frequency you have to meet those standards. So all the parties that didn't cross-endorse Trump or Biden lost their ballot lines in 2020. So this year, there were 7 efforts to put additional candidates on the ballot tickets for governor and lieutenant governor, and they all failed because you need 45,000 signatures in 42 days, which from my research is the hardest comparable petition in the world. The nearest I could find was if you want to run as an independent for the State Duma in Russia, like their Congress, from an oblast, which is like their states. And the representative of the State Duma is the highest office from an oblast. There it's 15,000 signatures in 45 days. And very few are able to do that. New York's old standard was 15,000 in 42 days. And I've tried to get a law introduced to change back to the old standard. And I joke with the legislators, we just want to get back to the Putin standard. And they chuckle and they say, we're right, but they're not going to do it until the election's over because they don't want the governor and the chair of the state Democratic Party who pushed this ballot exclusion law through the state legislature. They don't want them on their back while they run for re-election. So here we are. So on yesterday, we had a motion before the Second Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals to issue an injunction to put us on the ballot because we're likely to win this case. We've had working through the courts for a couple of years. We also asked, if you don't do that, expedite the process of making a decision on our lawsuit against the ballot exclusion law. And they granted that, but by granting that, expediting it means they'll schedule it when they get back in session in September, early in the fall, hopefully. But that's getting up pretty close to the election. So it doesn't look like we're going to get relief in the courts. And so what we have in New York is, all these 7 petitions were rejected. None of us got enough signatures. None of us got 45,000 qualified signatures or even 45,000 raw signatures. So this will be the first election since official ballots started to be issued in 1891, except for 1946, when only the Democratic and Republican candidates will be on the ballot. And for progressives in New York, they don't have a choice. The governor, the Democrat, Kathy Hochul, is a cautious neoliberal corporate centrist, and the Republican is a Trump Republican on the extreme right. So if we don't get on the ballot, and we doesn't look like we are, we're going to run a write-in campaign. So at least progressives can voice their support for things like a Green New Deal for New York, single-payer health care, affordable housing, including a law to require good cause for evictions, and another one to a program to expand public housing, a state public housing program to create affordable units at lower cost than subsidizing private developers, things like that. So we're going to keep fighting, even though we're probably not going to be on the ballot. And then I know everybody's heard about what happened in North Carolina. They had enough signatures. The Board of Elections voted 3-2 in a partisan vote to deny their petition. And as that was being done, the North Carolina press started reporting what the Greens were finding was that the Democrats were out there harassing and bullying and browbeating people into removing their signatures from the Green Party petition. And this apparently is still going on because the Greens are going to go to court over this Board of Elections decision. And they found, among other things, that this Democratic-led campaign, and it's led by the Democratic Congressional or Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee under the auspices of the law firm, the Elias Law Group. Now that's Elias. That's Mark Elias, who many people know is the lawyer that took on Trump in his phony election fraud lawsuits with respect to the 2020 election and beat him 45 lawsuits or 46 lawsuits. And he's also, through that law group, challenging Republican voter suppression and election subversion laws in the states. But there's a dark side to Mark Elias. He has spent a lot of his career fighting to keep the Greens or independent left candidates off the ballot. It seems he's really concerned more about Democrats than democracy. And so he's leading this charge in North Carolina. His activities in this regard go back to the unprecedented before or since assault on Ralph Nader's ballot access in 2004, where they had 24 law firms, 90 lawyers sued to get the Nader removed from the ballot in 18 states. And there was a lot of litigation around that. He was unfortunately, pretty successful. And we got warned during the 2020 presidential campaign by Richard Winger from Ballot Access News that Elias was going after our petitions around the country. And as we know, they did in Wisconsin and Montana, where they also intimidated voters into removing their signatures from a petition, Pennsylvania. And so while the Republicans, want to suppress the vote and set it up so they can count the votes and steal elections, the Democrats suppress the vote by suppressing the Green Party. We know that from exit polls in 2016 that 61% of the Green Party's candidates' voters, Jill Stein's voters, would have stayed home if she was not on the ballot. That same exit poll showed 55% of the Libertarian candidate, Gary Johnson's voters, would have stayed home. So third parties bring new voters out. And if you suppress those parties, you suppress those voters. So the Democrats are all, self-righteous about how evil the Republicans are with their voter suppression schemes. But the Democrats are doing the same thing in a different way by party suppression. And of course, they've been feckless in getting voter rights and election protection laws passed in Congress. They could lift the filibuster with a simple majority in the Senate. The 50 Democratic senators plus Vice President Harris could change the rule, and they could lift the filibuster on voting rights, on election protection, not to mention abortion rights or climate protection or these care economy programs, or how about Supreme Court reform? But they're not getting anything done because they won't take on the filibuster when they have the power to do so. So, the Republicans are doing the same thing in terms of trickery and intimidation of voters. We had a case come out this week in Houston, Texas, where Republicans were out there with an affidavit kind of form in a Black community in Houston, Texas, going to voters and asking them to sign that they didn't submit a fraudulent ballot in 2020. That's voter intimidation, and they have represented them as being from the Board of Elections, just like some of these Democrats did to people that wanted to get off petitions in North Carolina. So both parties were playing this game of trickery. And then we had, in March, a lawsuit that was filed by the NAACP, Mi Familia Vota, and the Legal Women Voters against a Republican group that had made armed home visits to Latino and Black homes in Colorado and other states, basically saying they're watching them about fraudulent balloting and visibly taking photos of their homes. That's voter intimidation. So this is being done by both parties, but we can't let the Democrats get away with what they're doing with a self-righteous criticism of the Republicans who deserve it, but then the Democrats don't do anything about it and turn around and do it to the Green Party. So, we're in a crisis of democracy, and it's getting worse. The GOP is setting it up to steal elections. This case the Supreme Court agreed to take out of North Carolina, which is not only about gerrymandering, but the Republicans out of North Carolina are arguing for a formerly fringe legal doctrine called independent state legislature doctrine that basically says the election clause of the U.S. Constitution says state legislatures can determine how elections are run, federal elections are run in their states. And what the Republicans are setting up is they can basically then decide who wins, no matter what the voters say, or a governor says, or the state courts, or the state constitution. This independent state legislature doctrine says it's the sole power of the state legislature. So what we should be worried about is if in these Republican-controlled states, and the Supreme Court's going to hear this probably decide next year, 2023. So in 2024, if the Republicans lose the popular vote for the presidential electors for the Electoral College, their legislature could just say, well, we're sending this slate, which is for our candidate, the Republican candidate, and steal the presidential election. I mean, that's how crazy this has gotten. So, it goes back to what I've been saying since we finished that 2020 election. Top of our agenda has got to be a pro-democracy agenda. And the things we need to raise that are not even being discussed really is fair ballot access legislation at both the state and federal level, ranked choice voting for executive offices, and proportional ranked choice voting to get proportional representation in state legislatures. Proportional ranked choice voting means you rank your choices among many candidates from multi-member districts. And that way you get proportional representation of all the parties in the state legislature or in Congress. There's a bill introduced in the Congress called the Fair Representation Act. Unfortunately, it has only 9 sponsors, only 7 of the Progressive Caucus, none of the members of the Squad. That's something we should be pressuring, particularly those progressives and those Squad members, to get behind. So that's, I think, got to be our response to this crisis of democracy. The other thing I'll just comment on is, the bipartisan approach now to COVID is to just live with it and really live with it without doing anything about it. Like wearing masks where it's appropriate, getting vaccinated. They just seem to be, we're going to let it take its course. And meanwhile, the public health, people are warning about a new wave. This BA.5 variant of Omicron is the most contagious yet, the most transmissible yet. But people are not getting vaccinated. They're not getting boosted. The children's vaccine has been out for about a month now. And I saw a report this morning that only 2% of eligible children have got vaccinated. And I think, this is all a consequence of this right-wing assault on science. And of course, the anti-vax, during COVID has been part of that. But, they're attacking climate change, saying it's a hoax. They're attacking the teaching of evolution in schools. They got this Don't Say Gay legislation in Florida and similar bills in other states that basically deny the existence or the normality of LGBT people. And they don't want to teach the racial history of our country, which is what happened. They just want to deny the reality with this so-called critical race theory uh, bogeyman, which, that comes out of law schools. It's something that's not taught in the schools, but, that's a cover for going after, teaching Black history or Latino history or any of the real history of this country or the full history of this country. So it's an attack on science and reality. And so, how do we fight back against that? I think we can do a lot at the local level. We can win school board and city and town council races. Greens have proven that. Those races are local. You can get to the voters by door knocking in most cases, small districts. And, our record is very good running those races. I'm just saying we need to up our game on that and run a lot more people, get a lot more people elected, and create a political base for then taking these issues on to the state and federal levels. So it's about all I got for opening up today. So I'm looking forward to your comments and your questions. Amy L. Sachs, is Biden's executive order anything but window dressing? That's with respect to abortion rights, and I haven't studied it in detail, but that's what I'm seeing in the headlines and, just skimming the stories, that it's really not going to do what needs to be done, which is to codify Roe v. Wade. And that's one of those issues that it passed in the House, got filibustered in the Senate, and the Democrats in the Senate are not willing to lift the filibuster for this. And, Biden finally said, well, he was willing to lift the filibuster for this. He's been kind of AWOL on the filibuster question. But he said that after Senator Leahy of Vermont broke his hip and had to get an operation. He's out of commission for a while. So, now they don't have the votes they had before. So the other thing that's interesting, again, I haven't studied the details, and I know it's legally controversial and the lawyers will have to sort this out, but the federal government has property in all the states where they could have performed abortions preempting state laws against abortion. And what I'm hearing is, the Biden administration thinks that's too legally tenuous. It would go to court and couldn't be affected. But the people advocating it, are basically saying you got to be aggressive and, really push this issue instead of, the Democrats' main response to the Supreme Court decision was to issue fundraisers. I mean, that's what I heard from the Democrats. They didn't say go out on the street. They didn't, what they said was give us money so we can elect more Democrats. So in the future, we can do what in the past we had the power to do and didn't do, which was to codify Roe. So we were not getting a good response from the Democrats, and we got to do better. Amy L. Sachs, let me guess, the quote-unquote progressive Working Families Party isn't standing up for any other off-road party. I keep hearing about their supposedly fabulous new leadership. Laugh out loud. Yeah, I would laugh if it was funny, but it's not. Here in New York, as soon as their endorsed candidate in the Democratic primary, Jumaane Williams for governor, lost, they immediately put the corporate centrist Kathy Hochul on the ballot. And in fact, in April, they said they would do that because, as they said, we never spoil elections. What that did to Jumaane Williams by announcing it in April was tell progressives, Working Families Party doesn't think you can win, so we're not even going to try. And we're telling Hochul right now, leave us alone, don't harass us, because we're going to put you on the ballot. So, maybe that's their inside game. They think they can kiss up to Hochul, but she doesn't have a progressive bone in her body. She is a, Buffalo area politician who was very conservative as an elected official in Buffalo, including as a member of Congress. For example, she had an A rating from the National Rifle Association when she was in Congress. Of course, now she's all about, gun control because most people in New York are for it, and so she's done some stuff as governor. But what that tells you is she's an opportunist, and she will go with the polls, but she's not going to lead on any of these progressive issues that progressives in the state are demanding about a single-payer healthcare system, a stronger climate program, protection for tenants and affordable housing, which is a huge crisis in New York, protecting immigrants and so forth. So, the Working Families Party is really a little, pressure group on the Democratic Party. And, in my experience, they're more worried about fighting the Greens than fighting Republicans. I had the experience about 10 years ago. They sent in a year, it was an off-year election when there weren't many, big elections around the state or competitive elections around the state. They came into a city council race here where about 2,000 people would vote. And they brought in, about 20 people to canvass to defeat me running against a Democrat. I lost by 98 votes, 4%. It was a close race, and I ended up with 48%. And the newspaper asked them, well, why did you pick on Howie Hawkins? Because you had all these working families, Democrats running against Republicans all over the county. And the lame excuse of the upstate field organizer for the Working Families Party was, well, we have limited resources, so we got to pick our fights. But he had said on a Facebook post at 2 a.m. in the morning, he'd probably had a few beers. I was out at UPS sweating, unloading trucks. He said he would rather see a Tea Party Republican elected than Howie Hawkins of the Green Party, which tells you that the Working Families Party is more interested in keeping the Democrats, eliminating any challenge to the Democrats from their left. So they have a monopoly on the center to left vote. And so that's, what my experience of the Working Families Party is. They rarely challenge Democrats. They'll run they'll primary some Democrats, but if they lose, they back the machine Democrat every time. Frankie Lee, Howie, how can the Greens get some legal help finding these unfair ballot laws? Well, I think one thing we need to do is start cultivating a stable of election lawyers that will work with us. I mean, we do have some. Oliver Hall is probably the most prominent, the most experienced. He goes back to fighting for Nader's ballot access in 2004 with the Center for Competitive Elections. He's helped us some in New York. He's the lawyer working with the North Carolina Green Party. And we need to help people like him find lawyers in our own communities who are election lawyers, are willing to learn election law and take cases so that we can defend ourselves in court. A lot of times, the Democrats who have the resources will challenge us, and they're frivolous challenges. And, I had experience in one petition where I had the signatures, and I needed 1,500. This was a citywide election, counselor at large, and I was 17 short by the Board of Elections count. So I had to go to court. And I had won a case on behalf of another one of our candidates about 6 years earlier, based on the fact that the petitions are like an affidavit. The voter says where their current residence is. And those residences were still within the district. So they were good signatures, but the Board of Election didn't have that current address. So I had plenty of signatures when I went to court. And I would have won, except I didn't know, not being a lawyer, that in this appellate division of New York, if you're a party to a lawsuit, you can't serve the papers, which I did to the Board of Elections. So I was thrown out on a technicality. That's why we need lawyers. I didn't have a lawyer at that time. So I think, first we got to find the lawyers. Then, of course, we got to raise the money. And I urge people to go to Matthew Ho's website and make a donation. They're going to court. We know the Democrats have basically a bottomless pit of money and resources. The Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee has millions of dollars. The Elias Law Firm has a lot of lawyers experienced in this stuff. So it's a real challenge. So we need to raise money so that the North Carolina Greens can win that case, which I think they'll have a good argument. They had the signatures, and what happened in the hearing was the Democrats said, well, there's a question about some of the signatures, none of which were signatures that were validated. So we, as one of them said, I can't in good conscience vote this petition through. Even though the previous election, 2020, all the presidential petitions, they didn't examine a single signature. They only examined them this time because the Elias Law Group is out there soliciting people to say they want their name off the ballot, off the petition. And so that got the Board of Election doing this investigation, which didn't find the Greens were short, just put a quote unquote cloud over it. So I think the Greens have a good case in court, but they need the legal representation and the money to pay for court fees, and the lawyers need to get paid too. So, but I think the main thing for those of us in localities is we should be finding lawyers in our area that know election law and are willing to go to bat for us when we have to go to court to defend our petitions or our ballot lines. Amy L. Sachs, it's magical how Dems whine about Republican lawyers aiding disenfranchised Greens, but if they didn't F with us so much, we wouldn't need these lawyers. Yeah, we got a lot of grief in Wisconsin because we went to court with a Republican lawyer. The fact is we, got a list of progressive lawyers in Madison from a Green that used to be in Madison, had good contacts. None of them responded. We contacted all the Democratic and independent election lawyers we could find. None of them would help us. So we had to go with a Republican lawyer. And, that's just the reality. And, then the Dems want to turn around and say, as Rachel Maddow did on her, cable program, she said, we really are a Republican op, the Greens, in our efforts to get on the ballot in Wisconsin. And that was a baseless smear, but she's a conspiracy monger. And that was a narrative they ran, not just there, but in Democracy Now! Where else did I see it? Business Insider. I mean, that was the narrative that was the main narrative in the media. And the narrative was that we were stopping the mailing of absentee ballots in Wisconsin. And the mailing hadn't started. The Milwaukee Sentinel-Journal called around to election administrators in Wisconsin after the Democrats alleged, and these officials on the Board of Elections, or it's called the Elections Commission in Wisconsin Elections Commission, had claimed they were being mailed out. And the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel said, we can't find anybody who's mailed any out. And so the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel corrected the record, but then these, liberal media outlets like the Rachel Maddow Show and Democracy Now! And Business Insider ran with the original narrative. So by the time the court decided against us, after sitting on those petitions for we filed, and the court dawdled for 11 days and let this thing about us blocking the mailing of ballots. And then their ruling was, we can't rule on the merits of the case, not on the facts of the law of the case, because the deadline for mailing ballots is now, absentee ballots is now 2 or 3 days away. So they said, we're too late, even though they sat on the case for 11 days and they had all the briefs they needed to make their decision. I mean, that's the kind of stuff we run into. And, and the Democrats, set it up that way in Wisconsin. I mean, when the issue in Wisconsin was whether Angela Walker's address was correct on some of the petitions. She moved during the middle of the petition process. So the early petitions had her first address, and then after August 1st, when she was in her new place, the petitions had the next address. And the person who filed objections said the address was wrong, but they didn't document that it was. So in this insufferable 2.5-hour hearing, it was surreal. It was divorced from reality. They said right at the beginning that our campaign manager, Andrea Merida, couldn't introduce any evidence. And so then it became a debate. Well, is the burden on the person who objected or on the burden on the Green Party to prove their claims about the address? At one point, a Republican said, well, why don't we get Angela Walker in on the Zoom call and let her testify for herself? Because the Democrats were saying anything Andrea said would be hearsay. And the Republican chair of the meeting said, no, you can't do that. I'm ruling that out. It's too late to introduce evidence. We got to go on the record. And we assumed we could introduce our evidence at the hearing. So it was a setup. And, it's something you need lawyers who know the ins and outs. And there's often unspoken rules or, regulations that are not in the law, but have been promulgated by boards of elections and various decisions they make that if you don't know about, they can catch you and, basically knock you off the ballot on a technicality. So, we do need our own lawyers for sure. Eric Gray, advice for prospective local candidates like myself who would be running against well-known Democrats and or Republicans in our respective communities, basically overcoming name recognition issue. Well, door knocking. I mean, go out, introduce yourself, listen to people. Most people aren't so concerned about policy. They're not policy wonks. They judge you personally. Are you somebody they feel will represent them? Look out for them. So it's a gut feeling more than it is a intellectual exercise in policy. Although, your policies are important too. So I would say in local elections, the way to get known is to knock on doors. And then, of course, you got to cultivate the local media, find out what reporters are covering the race and what media are, and then, give them good stories, make their job easy. Write a press release that's like a news story, with quotes from you and maybe a supporter, and, keep them bite-sized, like a news story. So you're not trying to say everything in one news release. And sometimes, papers will just run with your news release. We just had a story out from the Yonkers Times that just cut and pasted verbatim in a major part of the story, a news release that Gloria Matera, my running mate, and I sent out. And, it just made it easy for the reporter who was covering the fact that, the title was Big Names Off the Ballot. I was one of the big names. The Libertarian candidate, Larry Sharp, was one of the names they considered big, as well as a Republican who was a pro-choice Republican, had run in the Republican primary, but also had a petition for a party called Unite, which is about, election reforms. I mean, we work with them on that. So those are the big names. But in any case, they just took our news release and just pasted it right in, what they wanted. So, and then in relating to those journalists, if they write something you don't like, explain to them what you think they got wrong, but don't be, hostile or, alienating toward them, because you got to cultivate a relationship whenever possible. So, be friendly, be helpful, and help them do their job. And then you get some media coverage. And when you're in the media, for a lot of people, that sort of validates that you're a real serious person. I mean, it's just the way a lot of voters think. So I would say that's another thing. But if it's a local election, name recognition is not a problem. If you're, going door to door, introducing yourself, you leave a personal impression, you leave them with a piece of literature that's got your name on it. And, the more you can do that, if you can, go back to that door and, start early and talk often. And, going back, you just can be checking in, so what are you hearing about the campaign? Can I answer any questions? I'm still running and I hope I can get your vote, things like that. So that's what we can do in local elections. As it gets toward state assembly, depending on the state, like in New Hampshire, the assembly districts are smaller than most, city council districts around the country. They have something like 400, 365, something like that. State house representatives. So each representative represents like 1,000 people, something like that, or maybe 1,500 people. But then in the other states, it's quite large. So as you get to those larger districts, then your media presence has a bigger impact, because the door knocking, it's hard to knock like in a congressional district with 700,000, population of 700,000. You got to target your door knocking there. But, realize that when you knock on a door and you talk to somebody and get a good impression, they're going to talk to people. So one door knock could mean, 6 people hear about you. And one of the rules that, political campaign managers go by is that it really takes about 6 encounters with your name. Personal, they see it in an ad, they see it in a yard sign, they see it in the paper before they'll remember your name. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So, door knock and then door knock again. Or phone call. You don't have to knock on every door. Phone calling is second best. The thing that in this research bears out, the way to be persuasive with people is to listen to them and then relate where you can, where your values are in common. And it's called deep canvassing. It means not just a flyby, introduce yourself and give them the flyer and then move on to the next door kind of encounter, but one where you actually stop and listen. And so instead of a 3 or 4 or 5 minute encounter, it's maybe a 20, 15, 20, even 30-minute encounter. But that has a much bigger impact. And you got to remember, those people talk to other people. And those kind of conversations change people's minds. That's, the research shows. So you need that deep canvassing going on all the time. I mean, as you get near election day, you're going to want to do some of that quicker canvassing, because you're going to be trying to ID your supporters. Keep a list so you can pull them out to the polls. That's crucial. And too many Greens, that's just like politics 101. And that's how you get the vote. But if you don't do that and you show up on election day and you don't have a list of people support you, that you got to, call and make sure they voted. And you can, at election polls, at least in New York, you can see who voted. So you have a list of your supporters in that precinct or election district, and you check them off as they vote. And then, in the middle of the afternoon, you see who hasn't voted. Then you start contacting those people, get them out to the polls. That's how you win. That's how the Working Families Party beat me in that race that I lost by 98 votes. We were doing the same thing, but they had a list and, a little army of paid people to pull that off. So it's really important that you canvass, you talk to people, but also keep a list. Are they supporting you? Are they supporting the other candidates? Or are they uncertain where they are? And those are people you may want to go back to and, see what they're thinking a few weeks later. Vicky Corden, how can we fight gerrymandering? I see no Greens even at local level in Florida. Well, that's really 2 questions. To fight gerrymandering, I think we should go straight to proportional representation, because when you have proportional representation in multi-member districts, it's virtually impossible to gerrymander those districts to favor one party or another, because every party is going to get its share of representation based on its voting support. So, people talk about independent redistricting and, but the problem is, if you're dealing with single member district winner take all elections, you're going to have bias. Most districts are going to be majority one or the other major parties. They're not going to be competitive. And so those seats are safe. And even when you have independent redistricting, a lot, they tend to go, they don't want to disrupt the lines too much. So you reproduce the gerrymandered safe districts that already existed. I think that's a diversion. We should go straight. The way to end gerrymandering is proportional representation, proportional ranked choice voting, proportional or ranked choice voting in multi-member districts. Now, no Greens even at the local level in Florida. But if that's your locality, then you should contact the state party and see what Greens they have on their list there, and start organizing meetings and seeing who wants to do stuff, and then find other people. Not everybody who's on a Green list or registered. I don't know if they keep party enrollments in Florida or whether it's more an open primary state, but even those lists, a lot of people, they just, they favor the Green Party, they enroll in it, tell the state they want to vote in those primaries. But Otherwise, they don't really want to be involved. So you need to be, recruiting among people who are active on the issues we're concerned about, like, universal public health care or a Green New Deal program for climate protection and economic justice. And then, start being active on those issues. And, that can be, I think public educational meetings is underused by the Greens. We tend to like to come out and jump up and down with signs and protest, but that's periodic. We should have an ongoing public education program. A lot of people want to get involved in the Green Party to learn and to take action. So I think those are the kinds of things we need to be doing at the local level, rather than just having business meetings where, we go over the bylaws or figure out who the officers are going to be. A lot of people, they're really not in it for that. They'll defer to people that want to do that, and these people are important to do the administrative side. They want to be, want to take action on the issues, and they want to learn more about politics and about the issues. So those are the kind of activities we need to do to build our locals. But I all I can do is urge people to organize locals and build your base there. I see too many Greens kind of float up to the state or national level without any base, and so they're really trying to make decisions for an organization without many legs on the ground. And it's the grassroots level where we build a base that will have an impact at larger scales as that base grows. Primaries are closed in Florida, so you must have party registration. So you can get a list of Greens in your, locality, whatever the jurisdiction is, a city or county, probably from the State Board of Elections. And it should be a low fee. I don't know. In New York, it is. It's reasonable. Florida, God knows with DeSantis, but those are public records, so you should be able to get them. That would be one list to start working with. Violet at Content Boutique. Any thoughts on the execution of Jayland Walker? Ending qualified immunity. Absolutely, end qualified immunity. That's one issue that I really want to push in this gubernatorial campaign we have. It happens that my state assembly representative, who I'm in the same American Legion post with, she's a military veteran, has a law to do that. And, she needs support. She got my support, but it's something we got to push statewide. And yeah, I saw the video. I mean, the guy, they were going to stop him for a traffic violation. And he, drove on a little bit and then stopped the car, started running, and they shoot him. 100 shots fired, 60 hit him for a traffic violation. That's cold-blooded murder, and it's inexcusable. And the problem is cops have this qualified immunity, which means they're immune from being sued for violating people's civil rights, like happened to Jayland Walker. That's got to end. Otherwise, the cops can do stuff like this with impunity. And that's just part of the problem. I mean, we got another case where these Boy Scouts in Michigan and some town found that all the firing range targets were black men, black men pictures. And, that's the kind of racism that is endemic in our police department. So we need to end qualified immunity so we can hold these people accountable. But we also need to weed out the racists and really reorganize these departments from top to bottom. And that's a big job. That's why, community control of the police was a big issue in our 2020 presidential campaign. And that's an issue we can do at the local level. You really can't do much at the federal level, although the article that I wrote up on that is on the website, talked about what could be done through the Justice Department to encourage community control and to fund it. But so that's something we can do at the local level. And, you got to make the cops accountable to the community they serve. And in a lot of cases, it's a black community that's being policed by, mostly white police force from outside the community. And that's where you get a lot of these situations then end up with what happened to Jalen Walker. And that's just, that one is just one of the really bad ones we've seen. Austin Whiteside. Have you talked to Socialist Alternative or chapters of other leftist groups? I know in North Carolina, the head of SA Socialist Alternative talked with Ho and hoping they are reaching out to help with the situation or spread the word. I've talked to Social Alternative. They've endorsed me in a number of my races, including the 2020 presidential race. And I've talked to other leftist groups. I got the Socialist Party nomination in 2020, approached, some of these progressive third parties in the states about their endorsement. That was mixed. Mainly the marijuana, legalization parties were the ones that definitely would support me. The others, it varied from state to state, but they didn't get on board. But I'm all open to that. I think we need, the big issue that we all share, the thing that unifies us is we want a broad left party to the left of the Democrats. And, Social Alternative, they have their own very tight organization, but they say they want a broad labor-based independent party of the left. And, I want that. So I'm all for that. There is no presence of Social Alternative in my community, Syracuse. There is in New York City. And they've generally gave me support. In 2018, they seemed to hesitate because Cynthia Nixon was running as a progressive challenge to Cuomo in the primaries. And that seemed to put a little pause in them. And occasionally, like one point, they were supporting Bernie Sanders in the primaries in 2016. And they urged a safe state strategy on the left. And I criticized them in an article in Counterpunch for that. So, I thought they were relaxing their commitment to independent politics. So I called them on it. But that doesn't mean I'm not willing to talk to them. I think they've done a great job keeping Kshama Sawant in office in Seattle and, are campaigning for the right issues, from raising the minimum wage to single payer health care and so forth. So, we should be having those discussions with those independent groups on the left. I would avoid the sectarian groups that really are about recruiting members to their own party, not about building a broad left. And you can figure out who they are by trying to work with them. Violet Content Boutique. Loss of our Miranda rights worries me too. What exactly is covered by Miranda? Well, that's it came out of the Supreme Court decision that said that when you're arrested, the officer should read you your rights. You have the right to remain silent. I can't remember exactly what they say, but right to remain silent is one thing. Anything you say can and will be used against you. I think it says you have a right to have a lawyer present. So people who are arrested are told that by the officers that arrest them. That was the Miranda rights. And the Supreme Court just said, nah, they don't have to do that. The police don't have to do that. So that just makes it easier for the cops to get somebody who's not aware of their rights to get people to say stuff that will be used against them in prosecution. And we have too many examples that have been documented in court of police, pressuring, even torturing suspects into admitting to things they did not do. That's why the Miranda rights are important, so that defendants can be represented by a lawyer and know that anything they say can and will be used against them, and it will. So the Supreme Court doesn't care about defendants. I mean, the other decision they made was that a death row defendant who had new evidence that could have exonerated him his request for a hearing was denied by a lower court, and the Supreme Court sustained that. which means, death penalty defendants, as well as other defendants seeking relief when new evidence comes out, won't necessarily get that. And that really undermines some of the rights in the Fourth and Fifth Amendments. Should Biden pack the court? Yeah, I think he should. I think we also need to set term limits, and Congress can do that. So like if there are 18-year term limits, you'd have, and they were staggered, you would have a Supreme Court justice leaving the bench every 2 years, which means every president would normally have 2 appointments. I think you need that. So, what we got now is, I think not all of them. Well, we've had a conservative majority on the court for 50 years, and most of them have been appointed by Republicans, even though Democrats under Clinton and Obama, there were 16 years there, as well as Carter's 4 years. So that's 20 years in the last 50 years, where there were Democrats as president. And of course, Democrats have majorities in the Senate many of those years, which also has a role in picking Supreme Court justices. But the way it's worked out, because this, McConnell in the Senate wouldn't give Merrick Garland a hearing, but he rushed through Amy Coney Barrett. So you have, an extra couple of Republicans on the right wingers on the Supreme Court. So, it would be justified for Biden to attempt to pack the court. That would be a big debate and a controversy, but I think politically it would be good for Biden and the Democrats because it would show they're fighting. Right now, they look like they're rolling over. And if nothing else, saying we want more Supreme Court justices and we want to appoint them would, tell the Democratic base, which is worried about losing the House and the Senate in this election, that the Democrats will fight for them. Right now, their base is wondering, why should I vote for them? They don't do anything anyway. Amy L. Sachs, but when was the last time the Dems put anything but tepid centrists on the court? Well, you're right. I mean, it's sort of a choice between extreme right wingers and tepid centrists. There was a study, law review article. I remember when Nader was running in 2000, and Democrats were doing their usual thing. The Supreme Court is the only issue, and you got to vote for the Democrats so the Republicans can't appoint. And that article showed that Clinton's appointees were more conservative than George Bush's or Ronald Reagan's. And what happened under Clinton was, particularly on the issues affecting corporate power and economics, the tepid centrists were really militant neoliberals on economics, like Breyer, who just retired. And that's been a problem. So on the other hand, I would argue that a tepid centrist is better than an extreme right winger when it comes to issues like voting rights and abortion rights, the rights of defendants. There is a difference. I'm not saying that we should all go out and vote for Democrats because of that, because there are a whole lot of issues. And if you reduce your vote to one issue, you're basically surrendering to the system that got you trapped. And we need a fundamental alternative that puts forward systematic change. Vicki Corden, what do you think about the case that could create more voter suppression? The Supreme Court will look into that case next week. It seems very autocratic. I'm not sure what case you're referring to because they are, they're on, I guess, recess until the fall when they start hearing cases. You may be referring to the case out of North Carolina, which is nominally about gerrymandering. The state Supreme Court, I believe, ruled the districts that Republicans gerrymandered in North Carolina are unconstitutional. And so the Republicans are appealing to the Supreme Court, saying that the legislature can do whatever the hell it wants. according to that elections clause in the U.S. Constitution. That's the independent state legislature doctrine, which is very fringe in, case law. It was obliquely mentioned, I believe, by Thomas or Scalia in the Bush v. Gore decision in 2000, which also said this should not be precedent for anything else, which is crazy. So I think if that's the case you're referring to, it's very dangerous, because basically it means state legislatures can decide, we get to count the votes, we get to decide who wins, no matter what the voters say, no matter what the state governor says, no matter what the state courts say, no matter what the state constitution says. And what that means in 2024, if they lose the popular vote for the electors for president, they can put their own slate and send that to the Senate for certification. That's what would happen if this independent state legislature doctrine is approved or affirmed by the Supreme Court. And that's the argument that these North Carolina Republicans are bringing to that case. So it's very dangerous. I mean, it basically would set it up so we'll have rigged elections. And of course, the Democrats will feel like they got to do it in the states they control, just to even things out. And pretty soon you're going to have politicians who are, entrenched in office because of gerrymandering, deciding who wins elections, federal elections. It's a very dangerous case. Mecha 1. What is the likelihood of unifying the fractured left party under the Green Party? I'm involved in DSA, CPUSA, and with the PSL, we could do as the French have done and create a united leftist front. Yeah, I'm for that in theory. The problem is DSA and CPUSA, that's the communists, support Democrats, and they have for decades. So I'm not sure they're really on the independent left. And PSL, Party for Socialism and Liberation, is very sectarian. They got their front groups. They like to control peace demonstrations. They're not building a mass party. They're building a cadre of their PSL. So, one of the problems in doing a united left is finding partners to the Green Party that have a base. And, the Socialist Party is politically compatible. They don't have a big base. Some of these state parties I mentioned that have ballot lines, the Citizens Party in South Carolina, the Progressive Party in Oregon, they're very small. They don't bring a big base. Now, I've tried to convince them we should run a unified campaign. For various reasons, they didn't go with that. There was a marijuana party in Minnesota that did, but it wasn't a fusion state, so we got the Greens on the ballot line, so they just endorsed me. I think we do want, unity on the independent left. The problem is there's not much organized independent left. And so I guess what I'm saying is we need to build the Green Party, and if anybody else builds something real, we should work together and find a way to work together. Violet Content Boutique. I just wonder if street protests are the thing to do anymore. Has anything changed for the better from them? Yeah, it has. We know from the mass demonstrations against the Vietnam War, particularly the moratoriums in October and then November 1969, convinced Nixon and Kissinger that their secret plan to end the war, which was to use tactical nukes in North Vietnam, would provoke, they thought, a revolution. It would have produced more mass protests. I don't know if we were in a revolutionary situation then. I was in the movement. I sort of had a feel for what was going on then. I don't think we had, people wanted to get out of Vietnam. They didn't want a revolutionary change in our government or our system. But it scared Nixon and Kissinger into not executing their plan. And, we know that from memoirs and reporting from people like Seymour Hersh. Yeah, it can make a difference. And that's just one example. Um, on the other hand, too much of what we have now in the streets is not that organic. I mean, the demonstrations after the George Floyd murder, that was organic. That just was a groundswell across the country. Occupy Wall Street, same thing. But on the other hand, most of what we have now are organized by non-profiteers who get money from liberal capitalists through foundations to organize around issues. And so they tend to be episodic. A lot of those protests tend to be choreographed. Like I went to the Poor People's Campaign sit-in at the Capitol on their, the first thing they did it when they got started, and they weren't ready to disrupt, and the cops just wore them out. I've been to other demonstrations inside the Capitol, so-called sit-ins, where after I was arrested, I was out in 20 minutes. They had it down to a science. The state troopers had an assembly line to get you booked and all the paperwork stamped and signed, and you were out of there quickly. So, the system could accommodate that. We might as well have been out in the, street, not got arrested, and just, made our point that way. It depends, but I think they do things, they let the public know. Now, another problem is getting our actions covered. And that's why we need to build relationships with the media and then give them news releases that are, good stories in themselves, that are interesting, or the kind of thing the paper thinks would bring eyes to or the TV station. That's another thing. You got to think about the visuals, because TV stations are more interested in the visual they see than the content of what you're saying. And then when people watch it, they get an impression from that visual. I've been quoted in speeches, and they'll have that visual, and I ask people, well, did what I say make sense? What did you think of what I said? And they said, I don't remember what you said, but you look good. You look like you really meant it. So, that's the nature of that medium. So the other thing I'll say is, if we just run candidates without being out there in various ways before the public between elections, then people think we're just about being in office. And they haven't heard about us, so we're kind of unknown. On the other hand, if we just protest, in the end, we're lobbying the Democrats, the more liberal of the two parties. And if we don't have an independent alternative to vote for, the Democrats will take the protest for granted and maybe give us some lip service. But no, they really don't have to do anything, because we're not going to take our votes to the Republicans. And, we're either going to stay home or vote for the Democrats. So we need to do both. Okay, well, that's been an hour, and I appreciate everybody being here. I thank you for the questions. And, I think it goes back to, we've got to build our local bases, run our local candidates, the things we talked about today about deep canvassing, doing that year round, having public educational events, being out there on the street when it's appropriate. All that has to come together with elections, and it's at the local level where we can have an immediate impact. I don't know what the exact percentage, but something like a third of the races Greens run, they win. And a lot of these local races, they're actually looking for people to do the work on various boards, and even town councils, certainly. So there's plenty of opportunities, and that's where we begin to build a base in the political system. It strengthens all our arguments for policies we want changed at the state level and national level, for election reform, fair ballot access, ranked choice voting, proportional representation. And so I urge people, we're in the summer. It's a good time to, start meeting, but, plan what you can do in the fall when people are back to their normal routine, and, get ready for what's coming up. And so That's all I got today. Thank you for being here, and we'll be here next week, and we'll continue the discussion.